Bruce goes, "Did you hear that?" I just felt the snow settle and it starts to move, and this fracture line opens up about 10 metres away and it just starts to unzip. And we're on a magic carpet that's going to take us over a 2,000 metre cliff. We're going to have 20 seconds to say goodbye, or 30 seconds. That's how long it's going to take us to fall. It was like 50 feet long, a sailing ship. They got rolled 3 times. Their mast was in the water 3 times. So I was in a big storm in Antarctica, but I was in a steel German ice-strengthened ship that was 100 metres long, but it was pitching through 60 degrees in one big storm, rolling through 90 degrees. So 45 degrees, you're sliding down your bunk, slamming your head against it, 45 degrees. And it was fantastic. Like the bridge was 70 feet above the ocean and the water was this high. The bow would smash into these waves, and I thought it was incredible. I felt so lucky. I do know someone who was on a tanker that sank, so who didn't survive that. So I feel that power is incredible, but it's also, like you said, terrifying. And the Southern Ocean has got such power. The New Zealand, the Maori call it mana.
Welcome to the first episode of the Peak Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Sanford. Today I'm joined by Adam Darragh, who's an incredibly humble man. He's a IFMGA mountain guide, which is usually 5 to 10 years to attain that certification. He's studied natural sciences with a major in climatology. He's also been a teacher at many places, including the local TAFE here in the Blue Mountains. So he's made an impact on many people's lives, including mine, and got their careers going in the outdoor scene. He's also a father and just an all-round legend. So I can't wait to share some of his stories with you. Let's dive into it. Thank you, Adam. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks heaps for bringing me on, Ben. Cool to have a chat again, and I really appreciated the time we've had in the past, right from when I got to meet you guys as schoolboys and came into the classroom at TAFE in the Blue Mountains. It was always a treat to meet some young frothers and to feel like, hey, I can put some things on the menu for these guys that'll excite them and challenge them. And that was kind of a huge motivation for me in my career and those 20 years I spent teaching people to be guides.
You still teaching at the TAFE?
No, but I'm still teaching bits and pieces. I'm sort of back to my roots at the moment with that Antarctic work. But yeah, 20 years in the TAFE system teaching people to be outdoor leaders and guides, and like having the opportunity to hang out with kids like you were when I met you at 15, a young frother dreaming about doing something at school that wasn't in a classroom. And
yeah, and I wanted to touch on that. Often when I do mention your name to people, maybe it wasn't the first time I met you, because I might have met you, I think, when we spreaded Eubanks Ashes or sometime before that. Yeah, I remember I'd started this Cert 2. Adam was our teacher, and there was a kid in the class who was boasting about all his abseiling experiences and how good he was at abseiling. And there's Adam, the teacher, who's done some pretty gnarly first ascents and all sorts of crazy things, and absolute humility. Didn't once say anything to the kid. He was just like really positive, and yeah, we're just thinking, do you even know who's teaching you right now? Which I'm sure. I know it's always hard to listen to people talk you up in that way when you're really humble, but yeah, you've done some incredible things. So
yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, it's really nice having our chance to be young and be cocky and be inspired. Like just the other day, I was at the cliff and some guy's frothing about the fact that he's climbed eternity with hexes, and it's like, how good's that? And I was that kid. So for me as a teacher, there's this thing about passing the fire stick or something. So I had these mentors who let me talk about my dreams and big note myself. And what's that about? Confidence. And what are people struggling with now? Confidence and anxiety. So if your confidence problem is overconfidence, I'm happy. Life's going to teach us the lessons we need. If you're underconfident, then you want to give someone the space to go. And sometimes being cocky is about dealing with your own unconfidence as well. Is trying to articulate what you want to be. So yeah, it's really good getting a chance to be with people who are learning.
That's a really good point. Rather than diving straight into Adam's timeline, which is very interesting, I'm going to start with the story of our closest calls with death, and I'll give you an example of one of mine. In Peru in 2019, I was with my friend Taylor Sullivan, who's a Canadian, and we were climbing a mountain called Mount Adam Darragh, and it's about 6,000 meter peak, and we were about 400 meters shy of the summit, and I was seconding up a pitch, and a microwave-sized chunk of ice literally whizzed past within a meter of me, just vroom, and then shattered down below. And I was very grateful to be a meter to the right there. That's for sure. Otherwise, I wouldn't be sitting here right now with you. And I've also got one more story. There's plenty, actually. I wrote a list, but I was very lucky. I was ropeless climbing with a friend, Gavin Lang, who lives in New Zealand. He's a mountain guide as well. And we were doing a ski descent of the minarets on the west coast. And we were ropeless climbing to the peak, pretty much just walking for the top of the peak. It's not very steep. And I broke through. I stood exactly where Gavin had stood, and I was up to my waist, sort of my rib cage, in the snow. I could just see it black, just the black of the crevasse below me, and my bag and my arms were kind of holding me there. And luckily it was narrow enough that I didn't just go down fully unroped, pushed my feet up against the wall and managed to push myself out. And then I just rolled back down the hill to get out of it. But yeah, that could have been the end of me as well. Those two moments were just luck, really. And I think the one thing I've learned on glaciers is I'm a bit heavier than most climbers. So if I step in the same footsteps, it doesn't mean it's going to be safe for me. Yeah, can you touch on one of your closest calls?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I always like to kind of say before this, it's a funny dance because we want a rich life. And one of the weird things we do is we put ourselves in harm's way to do that. And it's easy to glorify it, but it's a mixture because the fact is the richness of that experience comes from having survived. Like there's nothing quite like being alive at the end of a trip. Especially for me as a young man, it was almost, yeah, I don't even know how to describe it. The need to define myself through putting myself in harm's way wasn't about chasing adrenaline. It was about some form of trial that I wanted to endure to give me the validity to be a human. But just that whole notion of how much luck plays a part. And when we lose mates who weren't lucky, we feel sad and we miss them, and we feel lucky that we are here and we face our days knowing that lady luck needs to shine a little bit. The interesting thing for me on reflection is how my decision making has impacted those things. So that, one of my classic tales about dying was in 2001 in September. And most people might remember that September 2001 was a hectic month in terms of what happened in the US. And I was in a mountain in Pakistan called Great Trango Tower. And it was our second time there that year. We were trying to make a film with these wonderful people, Glenn and Heather Singleman, about jumping off and flying in wingsuits and base jumping off Great Trango. And we'd failed to do that on our first trip. And we'd gone back there on a second trip and we'd faced similar challenges. We had a 9-day storm. It was right at the end of our time there, and the day dawned fine. And as a mountain guide, I was working with a wonderful man called Bruce Dowrick from New Zealand. We both knew it wasn't good. 9-day storm. The Trango's this mighty fine plug of granite with these massive cliffs, but there are these snowbanks on top, and we had to walk snow patches on top, and we had to walk across this snowfield, and this 9-day storm had layered up in a really dangerous way. And I knew it. I knew that it wasn't good, but that morning Heather stuck her head out of the tent and said, I can't believe we're going to do this, and I kind of like harmony, and I really care about the people I'm in the hills with, and I kind of went, well, we've really worked hard to be here. And on reflection, I probably should have said we shouldn't be going today. Well, I should have. But we went and we're walking along, and I distinctly remember thinking, maybe this is too long, but I just went, fuck, I could just pretend to be sick and let Bruce walk in front. He's right behind me. And I'm like, oh, you can't do that to Bruce. And we're walking along this snow slope, and then Bruce goes, did you hear that? You know, and if you haven't been there, there's big cliffs, you know, like they're 2,000 meter cliffs. They're massive. And there's this little snowbank perched at 45, 42 degrees. And Bruce goes, did you hear that? And then it's like, I just felt the snow settle and it starts to move, and this fracture line opens up about 10 meters away, and it just starts to unzip. And we're on a magic carpet that's going to take us over a 2,000 meter cliff. We're going to have 20 seconds to say goodbye, or 30 seconds. That's going to take how long it's going to take us to fall. Actually, probably more, to free fall. And I just contracted, and for some reason that slab of snow just caught up, and it didn't go, and we just froze. And anyway, there's this process of getting off that, and then we're heading back to camp, and we saw Glenn and Heather, and we told them what had happened, and but there was no reason, you know, Bruce and I were like, fuck, there was no reason why we survived this. Like, it wasn't just luck. It was sort of a bit more. In fact, so when the first time we hit contact with civilization, Glenn got on the satellite phone and called up, and they said that these planes had crashed into the World Trade Center. And then we started hitting these villages where they had satellite footage of this. And I just went to Bruce, did we really die in real life? And this is just this virtual reality where crazy stuff happens? Like, it felt weird. But yeah, but the putting myself in harm's way when I'm kind of working and trying to have a good look at what does it take. It's nice not to have conflict. We were a really harmonious trip, but maybe in that moment you need more conflict to talk about, to try to make better decisions on that day.
For sure. One thing I might touch on there, actually, I think I read a post Will Gadd shared about decision making, and one of the guys commented that he looks for a reason to continue rather than a reason to stop. So he's like, always like, is it good enough to keep going? Rather than, often we're in this mindset, we're going to the top unless something else gets in our way. So we're just looking for smaller problems rather than finding a list of reasons to continue up that slope or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And I thought that's a decent approach to, it's probably a more conservative approach to climbing.
Well, or someone who's got the luxury of having done stuff to justify their decision making. Whereas when I first started mountaineering, 80% of the people in the huts came back without summiting because they talked themselves out of it, and you had to push the boat out.
That's true.
You had to be hungry.
Yeah.
And the things that got you weren't always on those hungry days. You know, you'd maybe climb the hardest routes and get away with it. But like you said, it's that following someone's footsteps on a glacier. It's having the edge of a crevasse crumble and realizing you're not roped up in that moment for whatever reason. Yeah. Isn't always on those pointy ends of the day.
And most deaths often occur on the descent when people have checked out. I've made it to the summit. Gavin and I had done this first ascent called Hotline on Mount Haas there on the northwest face, and we called it Hotline basically because we had Ryan just shooting down all day at us. One of the most beautiful summits I've been on, but it was sunset, so the rivers were golden on the west coast, and then just saw ropeless climbing along these ridges, and it was beautiful but precarious. But I remember thinking, I'm only 50% there, or less, probably 40% of the way back to home. So don't check out yet, because everyone just goes, oh, cool, it's just an abseil now and a little bit of down climbing. But that's when you make a mistake because you're tired. A lot of stories to touch on there. I know Paul Rogers, he taught me how to climb in New Zealand. Tom and I did our own course with Paul. He basically, I don't know if I should steal the limelight here and just let you talk a bit more.
No, I think that, but those stories about when we first go into the hills, so that's where it all starts. That's the magic when you have this dream and you get to New Zealand, you fly, you might even see the mountains out of the aircraft window, and you land in Christchurch or Queenstown, and you catch a bus, and and then when you meet the person who's going to facilitate that, how important they are, and that privilege of being a guide to help other people really paid homage to the experiences I had with the person who was my guide was Paul Scaife, who was a complete legend in my view, and in many in the climbing circles in New Zealand. He died in his 50s in an avalanche on Mount Tasman, in one of the biggest guiding accidents in New Zealand's, in the biggest guiding tragedy in New Zealand's history. 4 people died that day, 3 guides, 3 incredibly accomplished guides. But Paul was the person who facilitated my first footsteps onto glaciers, and I still remember that was in 1983, and I still remember those moments from that trip and how wonderful it was, and watching him in that environment and soaking it in like a little toddler watching an older kid ride a bike. I was like watching and soaking that in, and what a gift that is. And so to choose to end up getting to the point where I chose guiding as a profession, you talk about being humble, but it was like, for me, it was a massive treat. Like, I just did it because I wanted to. And it was great. I got these young people coming into my world, or older people as well, who were looking for something different. And I got to share. No one says how wonderful the experience, that no one tells a bus driver at the end of the day when they get off the bus, that's been one of the greatest experiences of my life. To work in a field where people actually tell you that routinely is really fortunate.
Very special, yeah. Maybe I will touch on that then. Yeah, my experience with mountaineering started, I think, when I was 18. My friend Tom Gilwood and I, from 12, so I was 12, he was 2 years older than me, started climbing indoors. Then we did trad, 15, and then 18, Tom's like, should we go to New Zealand? And I was like, never thought about it, but why not? Another friend and guide, Killian Kennedy, and his brother, Lockie, they were over there at the same time. And we started with a lot of easy trekking peaks because we hadn't learnt anything in the snow world. So nothing too technical. And then we ended up flying up to Tasman Saddle Hut. It was full. So Lockie and Killian stayed at Tasman Saddle because their objectives were closer to that area. And then we, Brad, Tom and I, had to make our way to Kelman. And we're like, holy shit, what's this thing? We're on a glacier, we don't know anything. Killian said, if you die on the way to the hut, you're off the team. Made our way over there, and Killian's like, just stick to your compressions, and we stuck to the bowls, and we got over there. And then Brad and I did Hotstetter Dome and Alma and Peak 9144, I think, as our climbs, and Tom joined the boys on Mount Green. And I remember Paul Rogers was at Tasman Saddle, and he was just like, you boys need to learn some shit. And yeah, he was right. We came off Hotstetter Dome quite late one day, and he was like, the fuck you doing? A big part of climbing in places like New Zealand is you want to get off the mountains by 10 a.m. if it's a solo aspect because of the avalanche danger. But when we did it, it was fully clouded out. It did stay quite cold, so it wasn't one of those days. So yeah, Paul had spoken to us, and then Tom and I decided the next year we should do a private course with Paul to fill in all those gaps. We didn't want to do a technical mountaineering course because we knew quite a lot of stuff that was already covered in that course. So Paul basically just would solo along next to us while we'd climb all these mountains, and he'd just yell at us. And remember, I think it was called Humdinger. We were on Humdinger and on the west coast, and Paul's next to us and I place a picket, and he's like, nah, shit, pull it out, keep going. Fucking hurry up. Just pretty much so serious, which he should be, and I'm glad to have learnt that. He had a lot of emphasis on speed and decision making. You can't fuck around, basically. There's no wasting time out here, which is definitely carried on to the way I view the mountains, and I've noticed my dynamic amongst other climbers is a lot more intense in that aspect. I'll be like, I know you guys are chatting, but you got to move fast while we chat. Yeah. But so basically, we're very fortunate to have Paul. That whole trip was amazing. We got 3-week high pressure system, and Tom and I got to do quite a few cool things like aspiring, Malta Bruin, and a bunch on the west coast, and then some canyoning and climbing. And sometimes you go to New Zealand like the following year and we didn't climb anything. We were there for 2 weeks and the weather was horrible. This was probably, this was the turning point for Tom to stop mountaineering, because the day we were flying over to New Zealand, Lockie messaged us that Caleb Jennings had passed away, or he was in a coma. He had a natural avalanche occur I think he was on a north face in Arthur's Pass, and he'd got trauma injuries. So we'd found out that on the way there, and then that week, Wolfgang and his partner had passed away in Mount Cook region. And then I think a week after that, there was a gentleman from police rescue up here in the Blueies that passed away on footstool. So we didn't climb anything that trip. We just went running and rock climbed and didn't see any weather windows. So that was it. We flew home. So it was, very privileged to have that trip with Paul that really got my mountaineering going.
Yeah.
And like good foundations, and I think that intensity from Paul was necessary. I remember we came back to the hut and it was totally different. Like he was just like, you boys killed it out there. That was amazing. That's the quickest we've ever done it. But like the whole time I was like, this guy hates us. But I really appreciate Paul's teaching. Paul also mentored me for my Peru trip with advice on the weather and what to do. So that was really helpful. Yeah. So really appreciate people like you that have made that possible for me, and probably you exactly yourself at the start of your career.
Yeah, definitely. And it's funny, that dance between being a coach and a teacher and trying to give someone encouragement and support, but in that harsh environment. And then some of that styles, it doesn't always work. I think it's a good male energy sometimes, like, come on, get your game face on.
Yeah.
And I tell a lot of stories about things that go wrong, but I have other people I work with where I'm like, if I've got a group, I'll be conscious. It's like, la, 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 don't listen to I'm going to tell you this, but you can just go la, 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 because I want you to know that this is serious, but I know that you're really aware of all the dangers and treading lightly, and trying to find that for each group is a lifelong quest, I think, when you're guiding and teaching. And it's really good when it works. And sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you'll get a client, who needs something different. And that's where it's really good working with other people and juggling ideas around and seeking. That's what keeps it interesting as well. You can't just press play and use that same routine.
Yeah. Yeah, it'd be an interesting dynamic. And not every guide's different. Like, I've climbed with, Gavin Lang. We did a bunch, but that was not a guide to client relationship there, which was cool. I would say, no, I'm not keen on that because of these reasons. And he was like, well, I'm not used to like having shared decision making because I'm always just a guide. And so, he said that was quite refreshing for that week. We got lucky. That was a good lesson. And if you can, when you go to New Zealand, you try and like set a couple of weeks aside when you're here in Oz and just keep an eye on the weather. And then as soon as it pops up, that's when you go, rather than going over there and just waiting for weeks for the weather to get better. I want to touch on some of your highlights in IFMGA career. Or actually, let's start with like, what's the process? Like, and what sort of prerequisites did you have to do?
Yeah, so basically the IFMGA guide is just an international qualification, and it came out of Europe, where guides worked in summer and winter. So in winter there'd be skiing and in summer there'd be climbing. And that process of forming a federation where between nations that qualification was recognised, and then it happened internationally. It's got spread internationally. So a couple of really important people helped bring that to New Zealand in the 1970s. New Zealand had a strong history of over 100 years of guiding, again with European guides bringing their skills over 100 years ago. But a German guide called Gottlieb von Elbert and his daughters still run the guiding company he set up in New Zealand. They're amazing. He helped bring that international qualification to New Zealand and establish that in that framework. And then, so for me, when I was going over there, I was dealing with really that first generation of guides with those international qualifications were in the mountains working, going through that scheme when I was a teenager, taking my first steps and with my eyes wide open and feeling like I'd got home somehow when I got into that alpine landscape. It's so foreign. It's so, there's often not much green at all, the odd bit of moss or this little alpine buttercup growing in a crack in a rock. But I felt some sense of homecoming there. And yeah, looking at how the guides worked and how often they'd look at someone like me and they'd share knowledge and they'd be excited for the wonder in my eyes. And so I was still struggling with what to do at that phase of my life. There's lots going on when you're 19. And for me, that was compounded, I guess, for my family went through a really hard time then. At 20 years old, my dad suicided and I had to take over a family business to try to help my mum get a place to live. And the mountains sat there as a beacon of hope for me. The Christmas, my dad died in late November, so that Christmas, I had a part-time job at Paddy Palins, and two of my workmates who I'd climbed with, one of them gave me a pair of the best crampons you could buy in the world, the Messner scissor crampons, and another mate gave me a J&H Expedition sleeping bag. I was just like stuck in my own little war of trying to keep this business running so we could sell it, because that was what we needed to do. And yet that they were these seeds of my dreams that were being supported by my mates, finding the way to make a life, like where do I fit in the world? And it was, so the interesting thing in Australia is we don't have Alps. We've got some snowy mountains or hills, but we don't have an alpine range. New Zealand's our alpine range. And so going there regularly, once I started, that was climbing was always about something bigger than the cliffs. The cliffs were our training area and the big missions. And so once I went to New Zealand and once I could get back there and I had an early trip to the Andes, that was my first big trip after Dad died, was managing to get over there and spending time getting smacked down by altitude and seeing people in what was a dictatorship in Chile at the time who were going through untold hardships. If you politically dissented, you'd get shot. And I had friends who'd seen their brother-in-law shot in front of them. I was actually volunteering on an expedition there, and one of the women, she'd had to leave school to get work so her brother could keep getting educated, because her father had been arrested in the middle of the night and taken away. And 7 years later, they heard he was alive, but in an insane asylum that had been found in the desert because he'd been tortured, because he had different political views. So there's all this stuff going on, and you're like, where do I fit into this? I'm so lucky I come from Australia. I thought I should study, and that's where I studied. I went back to uni and studied as much of the outdoor ologies as I could: biology, geology, geomorphology, which is about landscapes, climatology. And it was a long time. I'd kept going on expeditions and things, but I sort of thought maybe I could be a scientist. And I worked with some incredible scientists, a fantastic man who I ended up going to Antarctic with, called Professor Don Adamson, who was like one of those old school Raiders of the Lost Ark kind of characters. He helped found the spot where they found Lucy, the 5 million year old fossil hominid in East Africa. He helped find that site that the Lekis went to. He identified that as a fossil rich site. He had many seasons in Antarctica, and I went down as a field assistant for him. And then that started a series of events that allowed me to start working in Antarctica, teaching people how to survive based on my mountaineering experiences to that date. And that was when the guiding came more to my fore. And that's when I kind of decided to make a living as a guide. And I came to the Blue Mountains and I worked for the Australian School of Mountaineering that had been started by a couple of teenagers from Sydney in the 70s, Glenn Nash and Andrew Penny. And to go up there and start working for them was great, but it was always about how the mountains globally, and so that it was a natural progression to want to get the highest qualifications of that career. And I did that through spending a lot of time in New Zealand and then obviously oversee other greater ranges and stuff as well.
Wicked. I wanted to touch on how are you traveling to Antarctica? I know listening to Greg Mortimer's experiences, one of his most terrifying experiences was just the boat ride to Antarctica. And he's done some pretty wild things in his life. How was that?
Yeah, so Greg went down in I don't know how, it was like 50 feet long or something, a sailing ship, and they got rolled 3 times. Their mast was in the water 3 times. So Greg's story, so I was in a big storm in Antarctica, but I was in a steel German ice-strengthened ship that was 100 meters long, but it was pitching through 60 degrees in one big storm, rolling through 90 degrees. So 45 degrees, you're sliding down your bunk, slamming your head against the 45 degrees. And it was fantastic. Like the bridge was 70 feet above the ocean and the water was this high. The bow would smash into these waves and I thought it was incredible. I felt so lucky. I do know someone who was on a tanker that sank, so who didn't survive that. So I feel a bit more like, yeah, that power is incredible, but it's also, like you said, terrifying. And the Southern Ocean has got such power. The Maori call it mana. And for me, I guess that it's been a key part of my life is seeking out places, natural places with great power, natural power, because you feel really humbled and you feel like that's your space in the world.
Absolutely. I often think in the big mountains, like you feel like an ant, and that's a really beautiful feeling.
Yeah.
Like just this tiny little being amongst giants, and the insignificance is like a really cool thought, and then kind of blows me away. It's also similar to the concept of how many stars are in there. Like there's more stars than grains of sand, and that just blows my mind. But yeah, when you're out there and you're just this tiny little person walking across a glacier, the other thing you mentioned, like it's such a barren landscape. The thing that I distinctly remember about any time in an alpine region is just that it's absolute silence. And like the snow absorbs all the sound, and if there's no wind, you just hear absolutely nothing. And coming from Australia, where right now we can hear some beautiful birds, it's quite a weird feeling being up there.
Yeah.
In that. But it's very beautiful. I don't know how I reckon the boat would probably be the most terrifying part of going to Antarctica for me too, if I was climbing.
The interesting thing for me is I dreamed about being a mountaineer, and that meant climbing big mountains. And I struggled really badly at altitude. There wasn't a big an expedition to a big peak I didn't go on that I didn't have altitude sickness, that I wasn't on my hands and knees vomiting, that I didn't descend on my own sick while other people were still going, like it was a struggle fest. Whereas that big storm in Antarctica, I got up in the morning, I was bright-eyed, I went down to the mess that the crew had cooked up this breakfast. I'm like chowing down crispy bacon, eggs, the ship's like this, and there's no one about. I'm like, where is everyone? And I'm like, it was like, have I missed something? Has something weird happened? And one of the girls in the galley, she goes, Adam, they're all seasick. I'm like, oh, what's that? Does that mean I can eat more bacon?
Right.
And so I travel okay in the ocean. I'm scared of the ocean, but I travel okay in it. Whereas my biggest dream was about climbing. I kind of got whacked.
You couldn't do it, yeah.
Which is good. You talk about being humble. That's why not be humble? Because for me, that was my reality. I get humbled.
Yeah.
And I think that was good. Hopefully I'm a better person because of that. I just want to touch on that talk about the quietness of the glacier and the splendor of that place and that feeling small, because we started talking about death and blah blah, and here we are. And the thing is, people, we like those stories, but the power of the place, and I think the reasons we go there were about the grandness of that environment, and it was like going into a temple for me, and that's really that sort of worship. Yeah, there's that other side of it, and that there's a part in our psyche, but yeah, the beauty of the places is what rings truest. And after years and years now, I've discovered that some people actually go to the mountains for fun. My partner Jules, she's a hard climber, but she likes going climbing for fun. And I didn't get that for the first 15 years of my climbing. I went climbing because I had to kind of prove something to myself. And now I go on holidays with Julie and we go climbing, and sometimes I get scared and sometimes I have to dig deep. But I like that it's fun now, and I like sharing time with people.
I think, especially with things like ice climbing, I know personally I have to be in a certain mindset to want to do the sport. Whereas like you just go skiing and often it's fun. Like sure, you can have pretty gnarly days on skis too and you shit your pants a little bit, but overall climbing an ice route is a very different experience. And like a lot of people don't know that the main rule is like you can't fall on ice. Like, it's not the same as rock climbing on bolts. So just that mindset is entirely different. I think it's something you have to warm up to, or you exactly as you say, you are battling with something in your head to want to be there and do that stuff. So prerequisites for IFMGA, like to do that qualification, you have to not only do climbing, skiing, but also hiking as well, correct?
Yeah.
Whereas NZMGA, you can be just in one discipline.
Yeah, so the thing with that IFMGA pathway, and it's a little bit different from the type of training that we do in Australia. We go, you want to be something, a mechanic, a professor, you go to uni, you go to TAFE, you get an apprenticeship, and you start your studying straight away. With the IFMGA pathway, they're like, we want you to have done your apprenticeship before you show up. And that involves a number of seasons, typically 3 to 5 at the shortest time frame, and building yourself up. Like you talked about climbing the trekking peaks or climbing on moderate terrain, that's one of the biggest dangers, especially now. A lot of modern rock climbers can go in with super high technical skills. They can go into the mountains and climb some of the hardest routes really quickly. And a lot of them end up coming to grief on moderate terrain where the change in snow underfoot over an hour, all of the stuff that you learn plodding around, or being really fatigued or descending in the dark or route finding. So they want people who are technically strong climbers, rock climbing and mountaineering, but they also want people who have got a significant volume of time in the greater, in big ranges underfoot, and you need prerequisite avalanche study and experience, and that's the main one. And then you start the process, which is a series of courses where you do your first course and then you have to go and apply things and be mentored and do directly supervised days with a higher fully qualified guide, and then do indirectly supervised days where you've got someone like you had with Paul who's chatting to you about the trip, chatting to you about your preparation, chatting to you about your analysis of weather and conditions and equipment, and then who you might not chat to on the trip, but you often will debrief them afterwards. Or for us, the IFMGA thing was a more formal process where you're certainly speaking with people. And you can do that in a skiing context where the primary objective is to ski, and you can do that from a climbing context, and they can be in the same environment. Or for us in Australia, it's quite different. We've got some good skiing, but we don't have, that's not in glaciated environments, so you definitely need time on the glaciers as well. Yeah, and that was for me, that was such a special thing to persevere through that process because I chose to stay living in Australia, and I really had to leave my family a lot to do that. And there's a cost to them in that. My son ended up couch surfing for a couple of months when I was over living in New Zealand at one stage because he wasn't comfortable living with his mum at the time. And that was tough for everyone. And me being away makes it tougher,
Yeah.
And still being away is one of the tough things that my family have to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah, the cost.
Mm.
Well, there's something you said, I think I'll draw on one of the things Paul taught me. I think anyone should know, and most Australians come unstuck on over in the Alps, is like after any snow event, plus 10 centimeters, so any less is not as much of a concern. But if you get more than 10 centimeters of snow in the Alps or any avalanche terrain, you ideally want to leave 24 hours before you're on those aspects. And a lot of Australians come unstuck with, oh, my flight's on Monday. This is our weather window. Let's go for this peak. Oh, it's beautiful blue sky, but it snowed yesterday. And an avalanche pops. And that's, where things happen. And I remember for Tom and I, we'd be in a hut and everyone would be like, oh, where are you from? How old are you? And they'd always be like, oh, you're right in the bracket that dies the most over here. And I was like, thanks for the heads up. I'm aware of that. Cheers. Which is 25 or under Australian males. What they call, is it Zabriggan's Ridge? They call it Australian graveyard or something. Definitely, I noticed that doesn't happen in Canada as much. People aren't as aware of big snow events and going out without the settlement period. And the same thing, like people start ice climbing before they start rock climbing in Canada.
Yeah.
Which is quite bizarre to me as an Australian because it's the last thing you'll do. It's like the culmination of all your skills come together for that. But I think any Australian listening to this and you want to go ski some stuff, make sure you let the snow settle before you're on those slopes, or be really conservative on how you approach that slope.
Yeah, because the curly thing is, like in New Zealand, the best skiing is in the first 24 hours after
Exactly,
fresh snow. And that's one of the real struggles. I mean, even in Australia now, as people are skiing on steeper terrain, that's becoming more of an issue. If you ski on low angle terrain, it's less of an issue because,
we've always got some pretty icy layers underneath in New Zealand and Oz as well, so much more prone to propagation. So I might try and go to some of the questions I had for you. Some of your first ascents and expeditions. Have you got any ones you'd really like to touch on that have been really meaningful for you?
Yeah, I mean, the big, like for me, there's one trip where I managed to actually pull it off because I was going on some big expeditions, and that was in the days when you'd go to a mountain range and you'd be in a small group and you'd be camping by yourselves as a small group, and you had locals help you get your gear to base camp, but you'd be working on the mountain on your own, doing all of the whatever work needed to be done. You'd be making the steps and going. And that was cool. That was kind of what we were after. And with big ambitions, the chances of being successful were for less. So, and especially with altitude being an issue for me, I definitely had a few of my big trips where I'd just be spanked and shut down and came back with double hernias because my body was, lose a lot of weight, be just really punished. But I, still in my late 20s, I went with some Kiwi friends to the Khumbu region, and there was a mountain there called Cholatse. Not Lhotse, but Cholatse, which is in the Gokyo Valley, between the Gokyo Valley and the Khumbu Valley. A beautiful, small but technical peak at 6,440 meters. And at that stage, it hadn't been climbed tons, and we were trying a route that hadn't been completed to the top. But I got sick really early on, so I watched my friends climb it over 5 days and 5 nights. So sat in base camp with binoculars and a long lens on a camera. I watched them climbing this technical route, and they came down. But in that time, I'd read a book called The Power of One by Bryce Courtney about this first with the head, then with the heart. That way small can beat big. And I decided that I wasn't going to go home without climbing it. And I said, I'm going to climb it. And I'd done some climbing by myself. I'd got to know the joys of that. But it wasn't necessarily healthy. And it was just certainly for me that there was a fire, and fires can burn you. In fact, I mean, at the time, I think my friend Derek was talking about going home, and I said, if you want to go home, that's fine. Just fuck off and leave me with some stove and some fuel and some rice, because I'm not going home. And I went on this mountain by myself, and I climbed it over 3 days and 3 nights, and it was the first solo ascent of that peak. 10 years later, it got its second solo ascent by a harder route, by a guy called Uli Steck, which is quite famous mountaineer. And I think Climbing Magazine said, Uli's done the first solo ascent of Cholatse, and I sent him an email saying, no, it was...
Second.
But that was pretty special to do that. There was a whole lot of emotions for me, and I managed to pull it off. I had the experience of slipping. One of the guys, Cam, who'd climbed it, he said, he said, you can do it, Adam. He expressed a lot of confidence in me, and he talked to me about sections. I only had enough. I had a 6mm rope that was 60 meters long. I took enough anchors so I could do 3 abseils, 100 meters of abseiling, but I knew I'd have to down climb a lot. And, there's a section where he said, don't fall, and I'm climbing down using the shaft of my axe. It was a little bit late, just after midday, and my feet popped off and I was dangling by one arm. My heart rate went up and I managed to keep it together, but not necessarily when you climb something like that and you get away with it. For someone like me, that was maybe time to pause and not get too carried away. It's quite good coming home and nothing had changed in the world. No one really knew what I'd been through, apart from a few people. And that sort of, again, part of that humbling experience, because you don't want to believe your own advertising too much. But it was good. It was good to go. I managed to have that feeling. In fact, when I got to a point where I could see I was going to reach the summit. I'd got through the most difficult climbing, and I looked at the summit and I just started sobbing my heart out, like I was just bawling my eyes out, which, because I just felt, oh my God, this is happening. And it was powerful. Yeah, there's a whole lot invested in over your psyche and your soul into those experiences. But you come home and life goes on, and it hasn't changed anything, and the problems of the world are still the problems of the world. So that's its own little lesson.
Yeah, coming home can be tricky as well.
Yeah. So that was kind of one of the big things. And then I'd have adventures at home with friends. Some of my quirky friends who liked to taste the pie, the adventure pie. I've got a buddy, Barefoot Brian, and I did some big adventures with him on climbs that they were big, loose, like, those dog face walls and things like that. So they're not necessarily sought out by many people at all. In fact, most climbers actively keep away from that type of stuff. But that was you always knew you'd been on an adventure when you came home after those days, and you'd feel a deep sense of satisfaction and contentment for months. So it was a sort of form of medication or therapy or whatever.
Just for anyone listening, Dogface is a big slab, big flat wall in the Blue Mountains in Katoomba in the 30s. Overnight, half the wall came off and revealed this big blank slab, which is why it's so sandy and chossy, because it hasn't had as much time to erode and weather like many of the other cliffs in the Blue Mountains. And it's notoriously quite scary. I've never climbed on it. Adam's told me to get on it, and I still haven't been on there. Probably should. But there's plenty of stories of people wiggling bolts out with their fingertips or snapping the bolts. And Yeah, everyone has a good story on that wall. I don't think anyone's been up it without having some sort of journey or epic. I wanted to touch on like the mindset behind soloing, or like how you feel in that process.
Yeah, I think that what happens is you have a big dream and you want to try to do something. And so you become quite fixated about it, in the sense that you're going there to do that. And then when you're on it, yeah, you're on it. And there's not really any space. You're not distracted. It takes those things, they do take the full focus. And when you get in that zone, when you're feeling powerful and strong and in the right place, um, they're pretty special. There's also an element for me about trying to get in touch with some intuitive space, because there is a lot of uncertainty, and the decision making can't be, do I do this or do that? It has to kind of be clearer. And so on that time, I'd gone up to a place where we'd had a platform, and I laid out my bivy bag, and I'm just in my sleeping bag, just on this flat space. And at midnight, I woke up and I could see the stars, and I went, I need to climb. And I just unpacked up, and I started climbing through the dark, and I mean, and that's when it's colder. That's when conditions are good. But and then you're dealing with that route finding in the dark. It was a bit of a rib. And then I got to a spot. It was the first spot that you could actually sit down or lay down about 4 hours later. And I felt a bit sick. So I just lay down in my sleeping bag, and I set my alarm because I thought I'd need to leave here early in the morning, still at 7 o'clock. Set my alarm for 7 o'clock. It was probably 5 o'clock. I'd climbed for 4 or 5 hours. And my alarm went off, and I woke up and I went, oh, fuck, I'm not going anywhere right now. I'm going to stay here. So I just lay down again. And then later on, the sun came up a bit, and I made a cup of tea, and I sat on a ledge, and I used the same tea bag 7 times. And then I thought, oh, I'll make a shelter here. So I dug a snow cave, which takes a couple of hours, especially at altitude. But I had this safe haven halfway up the face then. And I just had to wait till the morning. And in the morning, I packed up everything and I started climbing. I took all my gear because I thought it was going to be another night out higher up. But as it was, I was back in that snow cave that night. Or by 1:30 in the afternoon, I got back to there after getting to the top. So, but yeah, you're not really thinking about much. At one spate, when I sat on the top, because I straddled it, there's this little summit. I had this little film camera, and I mean, we didn't even call them selfies then, but I'm like, make sure you take a photo of yourself. Make sure you can prove that you're here.
Yeah.
But they were in base camp watching me with through the telephoto LED. They had photos of me, so it was good. And there was actually a guy on Gokyo-ri, one of the sort of famous little trekking peaks, who was watching me with binoculars that day, who I met on the walk out, an American mountaineer, which was a kind of serendipitous meeting. It was one of the only people I spoke to, just obviously a climber heading in on an expedition. And he's like, where have you been? I said, oh, I was climbing Cholatse. He goes, oh, you never believe. I said, where are you going? He goes, we're going to Pomori, great. And he said, Cholatse. He said, oh, I was at Gokyo-ri 3 days ago, and I saw this guy's summit. I said, that was me.
That's so cool.
He goes, and then he disappeared into the clouds at 1:30. I said, yeah, that was my snow cave. I knew I had to get out. That afternoon was going to be bad. So, but yeah, no, finding a space to be of real focus. And sometimes, yeah, it's a funny one because it's a dangerous game to play, I think. But there's something about it that feels really good. And even on some rock climbs, when you get to that space, if that's what you're needing and you're climbing like that, that's a wonderful experience. But yeah, I've been back on a climb that I've climbed like that with a rope and felt terrified and felt sick and thought, this is God, I can't imagine anything worse than trying to be on here without a rope. So it has to be right.
Yeah, it's a particular mindset and space and time. That's really cool. So you, with that climb, you had 3 days, 3 nights, but you rested for a day in between?
Yeah, I left it. I left early in the morning because I had to get through an ice fall and a glacier, and then I spent the day on this little ledge, and that was when I started climbing at midnight. And then the second night was in the snow cave, and then I got back to that snow cave, and then I still had quite a long descent, but descending, it was sort of in the bag by then. I just had to keep my shit together. And I was back on the glacier. I got through the ice fall by 9 o'clock in the morning. I was ready to be home. I was ready to be out of off the mountain by then. And my mates were there, and we started walking out the next day. I was so wasted. I actually didn't make it to the village where we camped. I had a sleeping bag, and I just curled up in a yak shelter.
That's really cool. Yeah. That's when I remember even just doing aspiring, I'd probably carried way more than we needed to because I'd planned to do, it's not Brewster, what's across the valley from aspiring?
Avalanche? Or
There's another one. And there's a hut there. But anyway, we had planned to do aspiring and then that other one, and I'd carried a heap of food. And
right across the Liverpool Beer, across the other
I
side.
think so.
You were going to go.
Yeah, we were going to go across.
Oh, awesome. That's a
but I
good
don't
mission.
think the weather allowed. But yeah, I just remember walking along the glacier back to our tent at the base of the Southwest Ridge, and it was just like wasting away. I was just burning muscle, and yeah, Lockie Kennedy was like, "What happened to you?" When we got back to Wanaka or somewhere, he's like, "Holy shit, you lost some weight." And it definitely happens in those spaces. You can't eat anywhere near enough for what you're burning.
That was a 3-day climb, and I lost 5 kilos.
Yeah. I remember I'm normally 95, 96, and in Peru I was 86. Just like, yeah, it just drops. And even if these days we have much more access to some dense calories that are pretty light with the freeze-dried stuff, but even then you can't eat anywhere near enough.
Yeah.
Some of your mentors that you've had, like anyone particularly significant in your life at different periods that's really helped shape who you are now?
Yeah, and the first thing is just the acknowledgement that everyone I've shared an adventure and a route with really important. And early on, the mates, like we talked about that, my mate Simon Thompson, who I was best mates with at school, we went rock climbing together for the first time, went to New Zealand for the first time. I spoke to him a few weeks ago, he's in New Zealand, so still a really good mate. So went to Arapiles for the first time. Our version of Schoolies Week, we went to Tasmania, the two of us, and walked the Western Arthurs and the Eastern Arthurs and climbed Federation Peak. But, and then, other key climbing partners, really important. And then as mentors, I had someone who was involved with the Scouts who saw us as young teenagers learning to climb, Dennis Williams, who's, again, still a good mate. He sort of ran a little beginner's course for the scouting for venturers in Scouts, and he was really pivotal. I mean, for me, my biggest mentor in the mountains has been Marty Bear. I met Marty when I was 19, going up to Multibrun Pass with Paul Scaife, and Paul's like, "Oh, we'll see Marty up there," and Marty's walking down. He was in his late 20s. He had a bunch of Polytech students he was looking after, just looked so at ease in the place. And over the years, he was someone I really looked up to. He was someone I got to know and went climbing with. He became, he was one of my supervising guides. He was really my success in becoming a mountain guide was because of Marty's support and mentorship, really practically, as well as what he represented. And he still just lives in Katoomba, and I'll see him this week. Yeah, and I think for me, he's one that really stands out for a whole lot of reasons.
We're so lucky to have had teachers like you at TAFE, like yourself and Marty. And yeah, I very qualified, that's for sure. And such a, most people wouldn't have that experience to learn from people like the two of you that have done so many crazy things. when we first went to New Zealand, we bumped into this bloke and he was just like, "Oh, Marty Bear." He was so excited. He's like, "He's a legend." And we barely knew who Marty was at the time. We were just like, "Oh, he's our TAFE teacher, mate. I don't know." And he's like, "Oh, let me tell you about him." And he's talking about the bear step and all this stuff and how Marty used to cut in all these steps on Tasman for his clients with a shovel. And yeah, maybe if you could share a little bit about your experiences with Marty.
Marty, I used to go over guiding, and like Marty was my supervising guide, and we'd try and sneak a trip in for ourselves. And so early on in my climbing, I think one of the first routes I did with Marty, it was the North Ridge of Mount Sefton. So you had to cross Copeland Pass and go down to the west coast. So that's normally a sort of 2-day trip. And then there was 8,000 feet of up and 9,000 feet of down in this descent. And I think it had been done in a day by a solo climber called Carol McDermott. But I don't think it had been climbed by a rope party in a day. And I was climbing it with Marty, and we bivvied at the base and we start climbing. And for various reasons, we ended up, you go up where you can. But we got to this pitch and Marty was like, "I think we need the rope here." And he had 4 wires. So climbs this pitch and places all 4 wires and he disappears and the rope goes tight and I'm climbing up. We didn't have rock climbing shoes or anything, but it was sort of steep and it was hard and it was probably running with water and you're carrying a bit of a backpack. And I remember climbing up and I was just staying on, pull out 1 wire and 2 wire and 3 wire and 4 wire. And I get to the top and Marty was sitting, he had his feet braced and he's just sitting on this flat section. He's just taking the rope. And I went, "Marty, I'd have untied the rope from your harness so that if I fell off." But Marty just as cool as a cucumber. And he'd have this little wry smile or guiding on Mount Cook. We got to this place, the Linda Shelf, and I'm like, "Marty, I feel like conditions aren't great here." He goes, "That's going to be fine, Adam." And we climbed up and came back with our clients at the end of the day and the whole shelf had avalanched. Marty's like, "Oh, it was okay. We weren't there." But yeah, it was just pretty remarkable. And yet he'd always have boots that didn't fit, that he'd have to cut bits off, and he'd have various angst in his life, and he often felt that he wasn't good enough, and I just thought, oh my God, this guy's amazing. So I think he helped me feel happy about myself because I'm like,
He was hard on himself as well.
yeah, it's always good to be happy if you can. Yep.
That's a good lesson.
Yeah. But incredibly talented man, still out there at 70, climbing hard. I'm not climbing, Adam. I can't do this. I'm hopeless, and it's like he'll be chucking laps of Wally's World at 22 pitch 22 down it.
Yep, with ease. Just wanted to touch on John Eubank. Do you have any big major experiences? I know.
Yeah, so John Eubank was this great inspiration because he was this teenager who took rock climbing to a whole new level through the 1960s. 1964, he turned 16, I think, that year, and he was his 16th birthday. He was with Bryden Allen, again a British-based climber who was the hardest climber in Australia before John, and they were climbing the Katoomba Cliffs. They were actually doing a bolt route up there. So there's this mythology around John Eubank. Every route on the Katoomba Cliffs between 1964 and 1971, every single route, and they were the biggest, hardest routes being put up in New South Wales pretty much at the time. John Eubank was on that ascent. He was kind of this driving force. He proposed the grading system that we use was the Eubank system. He put up the Janiceps, the hardest climb in in the country, I think at the time, in New South Wales, with one rest. And then at the age of 22, he gave up climbing and moved to New York to pursue music. And so when I was 19, John would have been in his 30s, I think, and he was playing at Sydney Uni. And I went along and I listened to him and I applauded. There was 2 of us applauding, so he thanked us by name. And I went up and I said, "Oh, are you the John Eubank?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, Adam." And he actually invited me around to his place. We had a barbecue. Giles Bradbury, I think, might have been there. John was involved with teaching Giles to climb, and I think I'm pretty certain Giles did one of the early ascents of the Janiceps when he was 13 or 14. But John was this larger-than-life figure, and he pursued his music, and he'd occasionally come out, and I got to spend some time with him, and he was awesome. He was a character. He was a flawed individual in some ways. He'd always be trying to chat up your girlfriend, or but he was a father. He was devoted to his daughter, and I haven't spoken to her since his death, but I'd like to. She'd come out sometimes and stay, and he still was up for adventures, and I got to go on some adventures with John, and they'd always have a John focus, you know. So at the time I was still smoking, and John's like, Adam, we're going climbing, but you can't take cigarettes because I've given up smoking, and it's a no tobacco ascent. And that, you know, that was when I sort of stopped. Like, okay, John. You know, he'd put his slant on things. I remember on some thing we're climbing, I put all my gear in and run out of the hand size crack, and I was pretty scared, and I was jamming in this thing, and there was a flake of rock and the flake was breaking, and I put in my last big cam and I said, take. And John's like, don't, what do you mean take? Don't take. I'm like, well, you'll ruin the ascent. And I'm like, oh, fuck, John. I just want to lower down and grab some of the gear from last side. Not going to die. And John was like, you'll ruin the ascent. So yeah, just clearly driven man, left a legacy, you know, and there, hopefully there's a book Ian Brown's writing about him will be out. And, you know, like I said, you knew when John had been in town, I loved his music. Not everyone did. And I was fortunate enough to get on stage with him. He called me up one time and I did one of his songs to open for his appearance at the Blues Festival. If anyone heard me sing, that's the only time I've sung in front of a crowd. I'm not a natural singer, but I was there with gusto, and it was great to share the stage with John Eubank that night, and one of my fond memories. So
unreal. I was just thinking how you mentioned, well, like Fantini he's still doing some pretty hard stuff at his age. But even I remember Will and I were doing the 1,000-meter climb at Pierce's, and we were on-sighting Bunny Buckets and then Randy Rabbit, and we'd done the other two previously. I think we were on Hotel Cali, on-sighting Hotel Cali, and you and Killian just raced past us simul climbing, which was quite a like stab in the back. We're like, oh, they're doing it so much faster than us. And you were doing the same thing that day. I was just like, oh, damn. I think we only got 680 meters in. We'd just done the two on-sites, and then we were like, it got dark and I was cramping up, and I was like, oh, what's the point? And the boys just flew past us. But that was pretty funny and humbling for us as well. And we realized we should have, if we're going to do that challenge, we needed to at least know where the brutes were and simulate ourselves so we could be a bit quicker. So we just gave up and we're like, oh, I'll do this another time. Also, I remember in Canada 4 years ago now, just before COVID. Yeah, we were on Rainbow Serpent in the Ghost River Wilderness area, and it's in this beautiful amphitheatre. It's called the Recital Hall, and there's a climb Aquarius, which is only WA4, but it blocks the entry to the hall, so sometimes you could have the two main climbs form, but you can't get to them. And Nisha Amerkiate, sorry Nisha, I've just ruined your name. I'd done Ice 9 or something, but I hadn't done a WA6 at that point. And Adam says to me, "Oh, I'll race up, but it's a giveaway for a 6." And I was like really, really excited on it. And then Josh came down and he was like, "That was fucking hard. Adam's sandbagging you." So it got in my head and I didn't end up leading it. But that was pretty funny and really impressive because I think you'd only climbed 2 days on ice that in a while, and you just climbed this WA6 beautifully. It was really nice to watch.
Oh, that was good. I mean, again, that same thing. It's like I've been out with friends. One of my mates who took me ice climbing in Canada for the first time, James Madden, who's a Canadian mountain guide. When I first went to Canada, I'd met him over here, but he picked me up and he took me out because, you know, I'd done a lot of mountaineering, but to climb that vertical ice is its whole other level. And it was exactly the same thing where James is just dancing up these water ice 6+ pitches, and I'm like, holy cow, how is this possible? And, he's like supportive and it was great, So I think it's just a little bit of baton passing, I think, that happens in that, and when you've got skilled people to learn from, you can pass those skills that you've been given on, or some of those insights, and that's a really fun thing to do. And it's a great thing to watch people coming along and feeling challenged. And one of the things you talked about ice climbing is, for me, and Eubank talked about this, is that it was never the challenge of the physical moves. It was really about what are the consequences. If I'm dealing with high consequence, high stakes, that's demanding more of me. And I think that parts of climbing that sort of inspired me the most and that I sought out were those moments where you had to step up, and in a sense you were the cost if you messed up. So you kind of got that reward at the end of the day. But it is funny walking up to one of those big ice climbs and thinking, are you really going to step into the arena today? Because things can go terribly wrong. There's nowhere to hide. I mean, modern gear makes it heaps easier, the old gear, but yeah, it's a great feeling.
I remember actually after COVID, I hadn't climbed for 2 years. Hadn't done a whole lot of a little bit of rock climbing, but yeah, hadn't climbed ice for 2 years. And my mate Doug he'd just had COVID that week and he was feeling pretty bad. And I just led the 4 on the way to Carlsberg, which is a fairly easy 5. But first day climbing in 2 years, and I jumped straight on Carlsberg, and it was really brittle because it had been -30 and the ice was horrible. And it was like 5 swings to get a good tool kind of ice. And Doug, because he was feeling sick, I was like, oh, I'll do it. It's fine. I'll lead it. And I had a terrible time up there. I was just like, it's the first time I sat on a screw actually. But yeah, I was getting pumped and I was like, what am I doing here? Get your shit together, Ben, or you're going to die. But we got there and that was a good experience. Oh, I forgot where we were before that. But I might touch on have you had any injuries that have been significant?
I like having adventures, and I'm not really obsessed with training, and which is why I'm not a particularly, like, if you look at modern rock climbing, I just missed the boat, which is fine. I'm happy. And I've got, one of my mates, he's got shoulder surgery coming up next month. And they're all incredibly strong. There's, the Blackheath locals are just renowned for being complete beasts. And I do get inspired by them, but I've never followed those training regimes, and I've never had any serious injuries, or certainly never had any training injuries, apart from I did put my neck out when I read about John Backer doing Eldorados, where you sort of pull up, and I think at 19 I put my neck out and had to see an osteo. I did have a wonderful experience of having my appendix burst on a TAFE bushwalk. I didn't know at the time. I sort of suspected, and I managed to walk out, and Julie took me to an emergency, because I was kind of shaking and had a down jacket on. It was hot in November, and they're like, why are you wearing a down jacket? I'm like, because I'm cold. I don't know if they thought I was after sort of drugs from the accident and emergency, but I did tell the doctor, I said, I'd thought about appendicitis, but I didn't get any rebound tenderness. Don't ever self-diagnose in emergency. And so they sent me home.
Oh, no.
And I was eating painkillers for the next 4 days until they rang me up and said, oh, we think you've got a false positive on your blood test. And I'd spent all this time at home just going, geez, I'm dying. I was too stupid to go back to the hospital. And so it was pretty much gangrenous. They vacuumed up the appendix when they took it out. But that morning, I just told the students I was working with, the guys who were supposed to be guiding weren't even up. I said, I'm walking back to the car. You guys need to radio me when you're ready to leave. And I said, if a client was this sick, you'd press the emergency locator beacon, the PLB.
Absolutely. Wow. That's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, that really makes you realize what it was like in the old days, because that would have been the end for me, for sure.
That's rough.
It should have been a lesson for me to present to emergency early. If you have symptoms, go to hospital.
Yeah, and don't trust Google. Well, that's a pretty good track record as far as injuries go then.
I did pull a metal hook through my hand on the Salathe. and the blood hit my shoulder. But I did continue. We just
Wrapped it up.
strapped it up and
Off you go. Yeah, I remember being on Tasman, above the lake on the Tasman Glacier, and there was some rusty old metal that I pulled on as we were climbing the scree slope, and just like cut my hand open, but bit of hand sand and wrap it up and think about it later. Maybe we'll touch on some of the Blue Mountains epics you might have had, or just like rock climbing experiences that are really different from the norm. Let's say you probably had quite a few.
I've done some incredible climbs with Tom Williams, and Tom's one of my major mentors. And Tom climbing's about going out to remote places in the wild, climbing generally from the ground up on sort of nature's terms. He was one of the first people to climb at Shipley. He's probably pretty horrified by what it's become. I mean, it is a wonderful outdoor gym and it's an accessible place, but for Tom, the experience is something different from that. And so I've done lots of wonderful climbs with Tom where we're really going into the unknown. Some of the trips have taken multiple visits, over months. One of the climbs we did on the Dogface top, we got halfway up and I'm just in a hanging belay. I've got a pack suspended above me to take most of the rock fall, because rocks are falling down as Tom climbs up. And Tom goes, "Adam?" I said, "Yes, Tom." He goes, "Are you feeling lucky?" I said, "What do you mean, Tom?" He goes, "Well, there's a block the size of old school television. It's not flat screen, He said, "There's a block and it's 50-50 that it's going to come off." I said, "Let's go home, Tom." And we backed off. And a couple of months later, I went back with a rope and I abseiled down because I thought I'd remove that rock when no one was below, but it had already fallen off under its own weight. So, I mean, you have some experiences like that, but the Barefoot Brian had this capacity. When I heard about Brian, I heard there's this guy in town and he's climbing and people would say, "He's crazy. He's really dangerous." And so Brian calls me up and goes, "Oh, do you want to go and do this climb?" And I go, "Yeah." And I go with Brian and it's completely clear to me that Brian isn't dangerous. Brian's doing stuff in his brain that I don't even understand to move safely. There's, one other climber who could climb on loose rock like that I knew, and that was Steve Monks, and climbing with Steve was like that. But Steve was like this uber athlete, he was kind of the top climber in Australia at the time, really, in many regards. And so what he was doing on site on loose rock, Brian was kind of matching, and just with what he did in his mind. So we had some great adventures, but there's two that come to mind. One is where we were repeating an old Eubank Aid climb. He'd climbed it, but putting in pittons and pulling himself up, and we were trying to climb it with just using the gear to protect us. And as we talked about, Dogface is really sandy, so the gear that you put in isn't particularly good. And Brian was pretty keen not to alter the rock, but I got to an old belay where John Eubank had placed some bolts, and I felt that I wouldn't feel comfortable hanging my water bottle off these bolts. So I said, "Brian, I'm going to put in a bolt." And I placed a bolt, just a single bolt. We drilled a hole and we banged in a bolt. It was about, 60 to 70 millimeters long, about 8 to 10 millimeters. Banged it in like a nail. They call them carrot bolts. And I clipped in that. And Brian, it was my turn to climb up, but Brian's like, "What do you think, Adam?" And I'm like, I don't want to put him off. It's my turn, but I'm like, so I start sweet talking him. "Brian, you're in really good shape right now. I think maybe this would be, you've been really keen of this climb. Maybe, it would be a real gift for me if you climbed it instead of me." Brian took the bait, and he climbs up this, his bare feet sort of scraping and the sands coming down. He placed these ineffectual wires, I don't even know how they held their own weight. And he's about 10 meters up, and finally, there's this little woo, and suddenly Brian's hurtling down, this black shadow, a bit like that boulder you talked about, comes screaming down, grazes my shoulder. All of the gear just pings out. And then the first thing I hear is, and it's the rope running through the old school stitch plate, and the smoke from my burns in my hand as this fall factor 2. there's 10 meters of rope out, he falls 20 meters, you know, and this one carrot bolt that's holding both of us holds that I just placed on a carabiner that my mate Mick Rofe had fished out of a canyon and given to me. My hands were so burnt we had to leave.
Oh.
But there was one spot where one trip with Brian down the Walgan Valley where we'd walked downstream and camped, and Brian just had a shopping bag with his pillow in it. We lost the pillow. If anyone finds a pillow in the Walgan Valley, it's Brian's. It was many years ago. But and we were trying to climb this, again, an old age route on a cliff called Big Glassy, but I got to this spot and I placed a belay and it could hold my body weight, but it wasn't going to hold a fall. And we didn't have the bolt drill. And Brian came up and he's climbing up above me. And I knew that if he fell, we were going to die. And that was like...
horrible.
That was just when you go, we're sort of flicking the coin there. And Brian didn't fall off. He didn't fall off much. But he did have some notorious falls. And that if that had happened on that day, we wouldn't have come home.
Wow.
Yeah, I think Brian's got 2 kids now. He's got a partner. He looks after himself. And those stories now sit as wonderful stories.
That's really cool.
Mm.
Wow. Do you have any advice? Say you were in your teenage years or 20s right now, listening to this podcast, like what would you tell yourself? Or like, is there a way you would?
Well, I love the thing is, like, I'd never listen to some old fart talking about history. History, when I was a kid, history didn't really interest me at all. It's only now that I can look back, and I look back to how long I've been climbing and go back again. And that's actually when I was someone my age, when I started climbing, was alive when they climbed the North Wall of the Eiger, like in the 1930s. That when Dot Butler climbed the routes in the Warrumbungles, that she was Australia's best climber. They were the hardest climbs in the country at the time. They just rope tied around the waist. She was barefoot. She was the barefoot bushwalker. And her grandson he was one of my students. He's still up in the shadow of the Warrumbungles farming up there with his family. So pretty impressive legacy. I just think believe in yourself and live large, and which is kind of what I feel like I did to some degree. I mean, that believing in yourself, I was so confident that the things I thought I couldn't do, whereas in the last 10 years or 15 years discovering sport climbing, I'm like, wow, I could have tried so much harder if I'd applied sport climbing techniques to things. So I felt confident to do what I did, but I probably... If I had my body back, I'd be trying some of those other routes a lot more vigorously. And go skiing. I potentially would have been a ski bum for more.
Pretty damn cool.
Yeah.
It's very addictive. I sort of dropped off with my climbing and focused on the skiing and snowmobiling and a bit of ice climbing. It's just so addictive. And the other thing, bit more morbid, but I feel like winters are definitely changing. And I don't know how long we will have, particularly Australia's not looking too good, but how long our seasons will last and how long that sort of experience will be available.
Well, yeah, totally. Like when I started skiing in the late 70s, early 80s really, the ski season, there was no snowmaking. The ski season started on the June long weekend and it finished on the October long weekend. And in the 45 years since then, those margins aren't there. The ski season shortened by 2 months. It finishes in September, the start of September, and it doesn't start until often late July. And that's a symptom of this changing climate. And that's all there. I studied that in the 80s, and and it's massive in New Zealand. The changes in New Zealand since the Industrial Revolution have been phenomenal, and that we're feeling those effects. If I lived in Ecuador in the mountains, I'd be looking at losing the water supply that all of my ancestors had lived on because the glaciers are going to be gone. And that's, for me, that's my biggest regret, is that I've lived with a generation where there was an orchestrated campaign of denial so that the powers that be that wanted things to continue because that's how they made their money, that's how they lived their life, and they ignored the science and they'd actively discredit people. And just so you know, scientists don't study science because they want to get the grant money. Scientists study science because they're these quirky, obsessed people who probably don't want a real life according to the rest of you. An obsessive scientist is just fascinated by knowledge and seeking that out. And yeah, that's the regret. That'd be the big regret, is that I just feel like we've been a generation that has taken too much. My generation, the older generation, not you guys. The generation now is facing some of those challenges, and hopefully there can be some changes made. There was a question that you'd sent me about some fact about meteorology, and so there's a layer. We live in the troposphere, the lower 10 to 15 kilometers of air, but above that there's the stratosphere. We blast into the stratosphere, but above that there's other layers. There's a layer, or a number of layers, that sit within they refer to them as the ionosphere, because the particles get the electrons knocked off them by all of the sun's energy. And the thing about the ionosphere is it absorbs heaps of the sun's dangerous radiation, lots of energy there. So there's layers within it, this thermosphere, where we think about it getting colder as we go up, but in the thermosphere it can be 200 degrees Celsius. So in terms of the Earth's atmosphere, you've got layers that can be... Now that fluctuates because they gain heat really quickly when they're in the sun, and they lose heat and stuff. The ionosphere also bounces radio waves. So when we first started experimenting with radio waves and transmissions, there was this magical thing that happened, that people a long way away could communicate because we bounced off the ionosphere. And that stuff was only discovered by scientists 100 years ago. So the fascinating thing is about how it can be 200 as you go higher. Yeah, at 10 kilometers, it's really bloody cold, but that layer in the thermosphere might be 200 degrees Celsius or hotter. But then the other thing is, around that area, there's that ozone, and countries got together and agreed to stop manufacturing CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, which were particles that were breaking down the ozone and leaving to large holes, and that's been largely effective. So, that the fact that countries can cooperate for a global agenda, we're going to need to do that, and hopefully we will.
Can we touch on how important the polar regions are for, like, what albedo does to the heat?
Yeah, so I was fortunate enough to go to Antarctica early in my career in the 1980s. I was the first on the ice in 1988 in a place called the Prince Charles Mountains as a field assistant for a scientist. And then in 89, I was at Davis Station as a field training officer. And I went to Macquarie Island in 1991. And then I had the fortune to go back. I'm revisiting that. This is the third summer I'm going into now, where I'm going down onto the continent, a visit to Macquarie and back onto the ice. And those polar regions and the studying of them, they're real drivers for weather and climate, and the changes that are experiencing there are massive. And so this summer I'll be camped. I had 3 months last summer, a camp beside this place called the Denman Glacier on the edge of East Antarctica. And this summer there'll be a marine voyage where they're looking at what's happening offshore as well. So we know that when the land's covered in ice, that the heat doesn't get absorbed. And we know that when the sun hits that ice at an angle, almost all of it gets reflected. And we know that the winter sea ice isn't so widespread now. And so when the heat hits the open ocean, it warms up the ocean. And everything from the way ocean currents get generated, which helps move heat around, like we often think about cold water coming north, but it's the engines driving is dissipating heat. Typically, the energy is moving heat towards the polar regions. And the flip side of that is as those air masses move in, then air masses move out and then being cooled down, sort of like a radiator. So our winter seasons rely on that cold air that's cycling back along sea level. But that albedo and that change is massive, and that's happening. And then there's all these other effects of that in the northern hemisphere, the northern European area, the areas of permafrost that were permanently frozen are breaking down, and that's releasing lots of methane and carbon, into the atmosphere as gases can escape what was locked up and frozen. And down south, big changes. And trying to understand that and track that. That's one of the things that we're still trying to do and know about. It's sort of ironic that, yes, we are using resources and fossil fuels to do that at this stage still. But hopefully, as technology progresses, there's an impetus there. And if you think about the technological changes that were achieved during the Second World War, the discovery of nylon and, the investment that people made to win a conflict, if we can consider that conflicts within ourselves to find a way to make sacrifices so that we can live more sustainably and be brave enough to do it.
Yeah, for sure. What have you been doing, or what will you be doing in Antarctica this coming trip?
Well, last summer and this summer, it's a similar program. This summer's the pack up phase, but it's a 3-year science program where there's an old base, as in there's a couple of fiberglass huts that were visited or installed in 1986 by some scientists. That scientist I worked with when I first went south, he was there at that time. His name's still written on the wall of one of those huts, so there's a lot of nostalgia for me. But yeah, it's the remote field camp. We had 27 scientists, another dozen or so support staff. I'm one of the field support staff, so I'd go out and we'd help set up little camps where we might be looking at dragging sleds over the edge of the ice sheet, looking at radar measurements or doing geological sampling or lake sampling. We'll be finishing up that and packing up that camp, trying to sort of a leave no trace approach. A lot of logistics. We'll be collecting, so we had some stations that were placed across the Denman Glacier. This is one of the fastest flowing glaciers in Antarctica. I think it's traveling tens of meters a week.
Really?
Yeah, like kilometers in a year at its center. And so where that comes into the ocean, if the ocean's warming up and it's lubricating underneath it, and it's really deep, so once that ocean water can move underneath where the ice is sitting below sea level. I think it's 4 kilometers deep, the glacier there. That pulse of ice moving down from the mountains is going to have a dramatic impact on sea level. If the whole glacier melts, which the whole glacier is not going to melt suddenly, but that whole glacier contains about 10 meters of sea level rise.
Wow.
That'd be a shift.
That's crazy.
Mm.
Yeah. Have you spent any time in the northern, like the Arctic?
No, just up in Canada, northern. Yeah, but no time in the Arctic. I mean, so many places to go. Hopefully in the next couple of lives, I'll get to visit.
Is there, with the climatology, other than Antarctica, has that taken you elsewhere, work-wise?
No, I mean, that was just as a student, really, for me. And so, but it was just understanding those systems from an early age, and the fact that it was a work in progress. And scientists were always upfront about that. And it shitted me that the sort of propaganda against that was saying, well, the science isn't settled. And it's like, yeah, true science isn't always necessarily fully settled. Someone like Albert Einstein will come along and go, yeah, we've been doing maths for so long since Pythagoras and we built the pyramids and all this stuff, but there's even more in there. that's not a reason to discredit it. That's a reason to be excited and go, well, how much further can we go with this? What do we really know? What can we trust? And it's not okay to respect someone's viewpoint if they're truly wrong and ignorant and pushing an agenda because they seek to maintain power or influence.
Yeah, it's bullshit. Could you give me a weather fact that's pretty basic for the average person? So whether that's like how high and low pressure systems work, or maybe something that like the average person looking at the weather has never thought of, whether that's like it's a 70% chance of rain. What does that actually mean? Or
Yeah, I mean, I think understanding the way the atmosphere, this thin layer of gases that surrounds the Earth, and it's actually thicker at the equator because of the centrifugal, as the Earth spins around, it pulses out at the equator. And the other thing is, obviously, we've got the tilt of the Earth on its axis, which gives us our winter and summers. But the key thing is that the equator's heating up, it expands, that all of the particles move further apart, so that the air pressure is actually lower because the particles, it's the weight of each individual molecule that makes the weight. When all those molecules get close together, it's got more mass, more weight. So it's more dense. When something's expanded and there's low air pressure, then air can move into that. So air moves it towards the poles, comes up, and then it goes up towards the top of the troposphere, just the lowest level of the atmosphere, and then the air moves polewards, and then as it cools down, it'll sink at the poles and move outward. That's the basis, that Hadley circulation. That was the basis of the first understandings from the 18th century, the 1700s, I think it was. Hadley sort of proposed this, and it's more complex than that. The series, our deserts are formed, but understanding that the movement of those pressure systems quite cool. And then within that, the idea that at the equator, you're traveling at about 1,800 kilometers an hour relative to being outside the Earth, because the Earth's rotating around there. But down at the pole, one rotation, you're basically standing on the one spot, rotating in 24 hours. That's it. So the air here, if you're moving polewards, you're moving towards a surface that's moving much faster than you. So a little bit like trying to jump onto a moving train. We used to do that because they used to have the doors open when the trains were moving in the good old days. Or jumping off or falling off a bike or something, you fall forward and roll forward, that momentum. That stuff's kind of cool to understand it. And that Gustav Coriolis, again, hundreds of years ago, understanding of that rotation and the impact of that in a sphere moving in space is pretty cool. So circulation around low and high pressure systems and the movement of that air is really fascinating. It's great if you're into flying, either in planes or in gliders or paragliding or hot air ballooning and some of the groovy stuff that we talked about that happens in the air earlier. That's pretty cool, and that's what drives our weather. So we've got, here we've got these big rain events coming through today and yesterday, but that's pulsing in little convection cells, so it's not widespread. So we had 20 millimeters here, but you might have had 40 millimeters somewhere else yesterday and 5 millimeters somewhere else, all quite close. So people say, oh, they got the weather forecast wrong, but it's like, well, if you understand a bit more about convective rain and that little process, then you go, yeah, we know it's going to rain hard, and if we get mist, it's just about that scattered approach, as opposed to a sweeping cold front where this band of rain will come. And the cold fronts, the other nice little bit of fact is that the fronts were named because the meteorologists had just survived the Great War, that First World War. And when they looked at tracking where the thunderstorms were, they went, oh my God, that looks like the battles we used to fight when we were in the First World War, the Western Front. And that's why they call those weather systems fronts.
Sick. That's really cool. That's a good fact.
Fascinating facts.
Do generally the systems move clockwise overall as well? Like if you're thinking about it.
So in our latitudes, the air is generally westerly, the front systems move around, but it gets impacted. So north of us, you get the trade winds, which have an easterly component, but and things are different at the tropics. So I've got quite used to these latitudes that I live and work in, but it's different when I was up in Darwin doing some work up there, really different weather systems, and the way they represent weather is different to the charts that are useful here because of the way wind works at equatorial regions.
Right. Yeah. And so often the high pressure systems come out of Antarctica and then like lows are coming from the equator, or is that?
So Antarctica is a desert and it's cold, and it's a desert because it doesn't get much precipitation because the air is dense and it's sinking. And it's like, wow, hang on, I heard it was a home of the blizzard. And it's like, yeah, what snow does fall doesn't melt, it stays there, might be compacted into ice. But all of this cold air sweeps down off the polar plateau and it takes those particles of snow. So you'll get blizzards. So it doesn't get much precipitation, but if you're at a windy spot like Commonwealth Bay or Mawson Base, you get lots of wind, this cold wind air that's sweeping down, like gravity basically taking this dense wind out. And then as that air shoots northward, you're getting an area of low pressure systems, and those low pressure systems circulate around in the southern hemisphere in a clockwise direction. And the cold air from Antarctica forms the western edge of those low pressure systems. And the really cold air is meeting other air that's warmer, and that's providing these fronts, and that generates these fronts. Like this low pressure system will be like a conveyor belt of fronts which is why you'll often, if you go down to Tassie, you'll go, oh my God, that cold front came through yesterday, but there's another one today because they're being created as the air circulates around, and this cold air feeding in, this warm air it's coming up against, and that barrier, that boundary is where all the action's happening.
Unreal. That's really cool. Is there anything I haven't asked you that you were hoping to talk about?
One thing that I find interesting is some of the changes in climbing. Yeah. And just that when I started, it was a really, it was a much narrower sphere of what defined a rock climber. Like the demographics changed massively. It's more mainstream. It's a bit like surfing culture shifted from the 60s into the 80s. We've got climbing in the Olympics. We've got brand names. You know, we know how to dress as climbers. It's not just stuff you get from the Army's disposal store.
You go to Katoomba and you see people that dress as a climber. They have a particular type of look and they want to look like a climber.
Yeah, you got to pay money to be a climber. When I first went mountaineering, I just got some woolen fabric and I got a sewing machine from a garage sale, and I made my woolen shirt and my pants because I couldn't afford to buy a woolen shirt and an air ticket. So I focused on the air ticket and sewed up. It looked like Christopher Robin because it was all the same colour. My pants and top looked like I was wearing pajamas, weird pajamas. Yeah, and that's been interesting, that, and the demographics shifted and the gender. You know, we've got, for the last multiple decades, we've had these incredible female athletes and mountaineers and rock climbers. And when I was started, there was really the trailblazers, you know, who were really breaking new ground. And that's just kind of neat. When I went to the Prince Charles Mountains, this remote Antarctic field base in 1988, there was no women in that field program, whereas in the at the Bunga Hills, the Denman Terrestrial Campaign last summer, it was 50% of the cohort were women. And that's kind of a cool thing, I think, to have that shift, having kids and my daughter, the idea that there's all these role models and a difference in that. And that's changed some of the way we talk and some of the cultural aspects of climbing. Which is, I reckon, a good thing, you know.
Absolutely.
I feel like there's a little bit less ego and stuff because of that. Yeah. And hopefully people are more considerate.
Yeah, that's definitely a good thing. I think often when I think of mountaineering as well, it does feel like quite a, like a lot of sports, you can break it down and it seems like, well, what's the point of hitting a ball into a hole? But climbing can be the same. It's like, well, it's quite a privileged sport to go get on a plane and go to some remote part of the world and go up this mountain. So I think it's definitely shifted a lot there. You know, there's these permits for Everest to go. I don't know. I think I've heard you pay between 30 and 100K to go do Everest. And there's TVs at base camp, and that's pretty crazy. So it's definitely, I think it's gotten a lot better probably in ways you've seen as well, but also there's that side of climbing that's gotten not so good in terms of like the impact in these places with such large volume. So it's tricky. I think now that it's so accessible to people, we need to do a better job of educating everyone on what the least harm we can do.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I mean, I think that the idea that things have changed dramatically and they've changed globally over the last 300 years, massively for everyone, pretty much. And then in areas like in the mountains and how we recreate or exercise or use those spaces. And it's sort of, change is sort of inevitable. I think change is inevitable. And then how that change manifests just means certain things. So the experiences of yesterday aren't there in the same way that they are, but there are other experiences there. And it's easy to kind of pick a spot to sit on your little high horse and have some view. But I think the big thing is that the big thing I'd like us to do is just, I feel like it's easy for me to say I feel like I've got an obligation to my children, that life's okay for them, that I've done something to help support them. But I think as a society, it would be really great if we could think that we have an obligation to our grandchildren's grandchildren.
Absolutely.
And that maybe if we just start saying, well, that is actually fundamentally important, what does that mean? Are we really going to take those steps? How many times am I going to choose to not fly in a plane, or how many times am I going to, how does it look? If people aren't challenged and seeking out things, then sitting at home and just consuming things and generating modern waste and stuff and eating unhealthy food and being a burden on the health system, that it doesn't all, there's contradictions, but feeling some sense, just some lens. Steve Monks once said something to me when we were working on the Australian Climbing Instructors Association scheme and assessing people and trying to keep that scheme happening. And he said our decision about an individual during an assessment, Steve said, what can we do that creates the greatest good? And I just thought that's a really good perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah. One thing I thought about just then was I recently heard the average basket of foods traveled 20,000 kilometers as well, which is a pretty crazy thought, especially in regions like where we are, where it is quite easy to grow a lot of food with minimal effort. But yeah, I'm not doing it myself. Like, we've got some veggie patches, but I'm not living off it. The expedition style thing really makes you appreciate the use of a tap or a fridge or a pantry, or the fact you can go to the shops when you've got to melt snow for an hour or two just to eat that night. You realize turning a tap's pretty damn nice. You're a bit more conservative in your waste and use of things. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I reckon. I definitely feel like seeing different cultures around the world and what people have and how they get by, because we're a really fortunate snippet of society. We've got this huge amount of resources backing us up, and how, I mean, it is beautiful to hear the rain on the roof and know that you're in a warm place, and to be able to press a button and to be a warm place, not to have to collect wood and light a fire necessarily. And yeah, when we travel, it's easy to have that romantic ideal about primitive cultures and societies. It's really nice that our grandparents don't die in their 40s because they've got an abscess in their tooth, or that we get the chance that women can survive childbirth most of the time in Western societies, whereas was this huge infant mortality and mortality during childbirth was such a massive thing in primitive societies. But like you said, the flip side of that is where we consume things, we take stuff for granted, and that little dance with how do we work things. And the question of values is interesting because it's easy to talk about what our values are, but I often think, well, how do I measure if I look at my behaviour? What is my behaviour showing that my values are?
Yeah, exactly.
And I know I value being in nature and being connected with nature, but I do like to be able to come home as well from that. But I think the natural environment and having that supported and maintained is really important to me, and I think that's probably the strongest one. I think within groups of people, like I'm a strong-willed person, I'll put my opinion in, but I do value harmony when it happens and when you're working in alignment with people. That I feel really grateful for that, and I reflect on that, and that's the thing I remember. So I think that that value of harmony and cooperation. And life's not always like that. So sometimes you have to be aware, have to understand how to move beyond it when things aren't like that. And then I think friendships, that connecting with people and maintaining those things. I talked earlier at the start about being with Bruce and nearly dying. I got to see him earlier this year. I hadn't seen him in a while, and it was 25 years ago or 24 years ago when we were on that mountain together, and it doesn't matter that the years go by, we can connect again, and we're the same people seeing each other, and it's really good. So I think having the capacity to really connect with friends over the years can be really great.
Yeah, I'd say connection's huge. I know they've done lots of studies on people that live the longest, most happy, healthy lives, and connection to a community is a huge driving factor on those on the more positive end of things. So I would say, yeah, connection and family. When I say family, I'd extend that to friendships. But yeah, I think for me, health comes first because I can't do anything I love without focusing on my health. So that's why I train a lot and love to get out there and do things, because you can't help others if you're not healthy. But yeah, I definitely wouldn't put finances there at this stage of my life, because I keep disappearing overseas and chasing some experiences. But why not? As a lot of older people have mentioned to me, I may as well get after it while I can, and while I'm free of a partner and mortgage and all that stuff. Yeah. On that note, if money was not an object, what would you be doing, or would you have lived your life differently?
Oh, it's funny, isn't it? Because in so many ways, I feel like who I am was based on the realities that most people face. And I loved that. I just think I'd have lost out. If money was never an object, I'd have missed out on so much.
Yeah. That's a good point. For sure.
Yeah. And I wouldn't be the person I am at all.
Yeah, they say money makes you more of what you already are, in a way there. So whether you're a good person, you'll be still good, or if you're an asshole, you'll just be an asshole with lots of money. Do you have any major regrets at all?
I just think a couple of extra ski seasons when I was younger would have been good. No, I mean, I think, yeah, I definitely feel like you make your choices. And I feel like I made mistakes, heaps of mistakes. I've got regrets in terms of my personal relationships, or maybe the way I've treated someone, or whatever. But I think, like, you get your dance card and the music plays and you get your time, and I'm at a more reflective stage in my life now. And I mean, I like to feel like I've given it a shot. There's certainly days when you're tired and you're not at your best and you don't get out of bed early or whatever. And it's easy to say I regret doom scrolling too much or whatever, but I think we just need to also be responsible that our behaviour is the choices we're making and that we should own them. And I hope I have.
Awesome. That's great. Yeah, so far, I don't think I would change anything because I know everything I have done wouldn't have happened if it weren't for those little moments that you did make those mistakes or things that you're like, God, it'd be really cool if this happened, but it didn't happen, but it led to something else.
Yeah, I reckon that some of the times I look back on now as my best times were that they were the rising from the ashes when my dreams had been dashed in that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can't grow without the battle beforehand. This is a bit of a different question, but if there's anyone in any time period that you could sit down and share a meal with, do you have someone in mind you'd pick?
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Because I think about great minds and I'm like, I don't even know how to have a conversation with someone with a really great mind potentially.
Yeah, I thought about Einstein. I was like, couldn't even talk to the guy, I'm sure.
I would love to be parachuted into Australia pre-European and get to observe.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if I had the capacity to survive that and to snip at that society, that would be incredible. To be able to walk on the lands that I walk on now where the original inhabitants who'd been there for tens of thousands of years, to be able to walk with them through this would be amazing. And I think even as a kid, I dreamed about that sense of this country and their place in it. That was always a strong thought. So I think, yeah, to sit around the fire with some Indigenous people way back.
It'd be really cool.
Yeah.
I always think that, especially around Sydney Harbour. I just imagine no civilization. What would this place have looked like?
Standing on one of those bark canoes,
Yeah,
holding it
would have been incredible. And the fact that Parramatta River was this incredible life force in the region, and just, yeah, when you're on the banks of it now, it doesn't feel the same at all. So yeah, that would be very cool. Yeah, I'm sure we could learn a lot from those people. I might wrap things up there. Thanks so much for your time, Adam.
Yeah, thanks heaps, Ben. It's great to get a chance to have a guest bag.
I'm sure there's many stories we missed, and maybe we'll do another episode down the track. But thank you so much.
Good luck with the project too.
Hope you enjoyed today's episode. Here's the part where I ask all that cringy shit that no one wants to hear. But if you could do the whole like, share, subscribe, comment, send it to a mate, that'd go a long way. PayPal me $1 million if you want, just so I can bring you some more episodes much faster. That would be really appreciated. Thank you.